First, I would like to give thanks to the land upon which I stand and acknowledge that we all live upon settled, occupied, colonized indigenous territory. Territory that has been protected, defended, and maintained for thousands of years by countless generations of Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. Today is it increasingly being recognized as Mississauga Anishinaabe territory, and I'm thankful to be allowed to live here in Nogojiwanam by the Mississauga Anishinaabe, despite centuries of treaty infringements, land theft, and continual colonization. Indeed, this land has been stolen, settled, occupied, but it still remains indigenous land. Hello, my name is James Willis, and for several years I've served on the board of directors with the KWIC World Issues Center and as an instructor with the Indigenous Environmental Studies program at Trent University. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight for our annual KWIC World Issues Cafe, an event organized in partnership with the ReFrame Film Festival and with the support of a few important sponsors this year. First of all, the Community Foundation of Greater Peterborough. I understand Executive Director John Good played an important role through his personal connection to tonight's film. And I'd like to also express a big thank you to Trent University, the First People's House of Learning, Trent's Department of Indigenous Studies, and the Indigenous Environmental Studies and Sciences program for all of the important work these organizations and institutions are doing within our community. So the KWIC World Issues Center, just really quickly, affectionately known as KWIC, is a grassroots global education and resource center, which has worked to enable a deeper understanding of global issues and their links to local initiatives for over 26 years. You can find out more about KWIC at the venue next door, where we are selling environmentally friendly Kyoto coffee and other delicious treats. Following Caleb Behn's talk this evening, Law and Policy in the Anthropocene, Fractured Land as 2.0, as Advocacy 2.0, we will have some time for questions and answers with Caleb and with Fiona Rayher, one of the co-directors of the film. So now to introduce the man himself. Caleb Behn is H.O. Dene and Daneza Cree from Treaty Number 8 territory in northeastern BC, working for the West Moberly First Nations as director of their lands department. He is also the executive director of the Keepers of the Water Society. Pablo Picasso once said, "Learn the rules like a pro so that you can break them like an artist." Caleb Behn may not always put paint to canvas, but his work is very much in line with Picasso's sentiment. When his territory was confronted with the pressures of extreme resource extraction, hydraulic fracturing, and the challenges of the Canadian legal system, Caleb decided to study law to learn the rules like a pro. Today, he is using that very legal system to protect his people and breaking the rules when necessary to defend the lands and waters he loves so dearly. Caleb is indeed a force to be reckoned with. In his own words, he wants to be the tip of the spear, which also happens to be the working title of his new book to be released next year. Please welcome Caleb Behn.
My name is Caleb Behn. I acknowledge my presence in Nogojiwanam, the shared territory, both Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee. Thank you so much. That's actually like the nicest introduction I've ever had. So that's a good intro to your territory. I should all be so lucky. This is the first opportunity I've had to actually deliver my own thoughts not about the film, but about what the film was intended to do and what I thought it should be relative to the stuff that I work on. And that's the purpose of this evening. So I'm very grateful to KWIC and to the Community Arts Council for their generosity in supporting me, so bless you for that. To the people, the volunteers for the festival, as someone who's worked as a volunteer for a very, very long time. I appreciate that. My intention, though, is just to go through a few ideas about the Anthropocene and about why myself and Fiona, Rayher, and many others sort of stepped into this kind of context. And for those of you who were at this afternoon's discussion, we sort of touched on some of these issues. And also about your role in West Coast culture. So I was educated in Coast Salish territory, and in the West Coast, the Coast Salish peoples, and most of the big house cultures along the western edge of Turtle Island, they had a notion that one of the reasons you're gifted in ceremony, in potlatch, is that you must faithfully recount what you've witnessed. And so you're gifted not only for your time and your presence, so thank you guys for your time and presence, but also because you have an obligation to faithfully recount in future what you've witnessed. And that idea, that notion that we should be accountable for what we've seen, what we've learned, that we should have an obligation to repeat and engage with the content, I think is critical to us in this thing. Remarkably eloquent. I didn't even remember all of that because I was just like so insane from the calling of the bar ceremony. There's a bunch of backstories. If you guys want to ask me any questions about like crazy backstories, I will give you all the gory details. Oh God, that was so insane. I was delayed 6 months from being called to the bar because I asked to be called and give the barrister and solicitor's oath in Behn. And my rationale was that Damien was the language that underpinned the negotiation of the treaty, and the treaty is the underpinning, treaty number 8 in that territory, was the underpinning of the colonial assertion of sovereignty. And from that sovereignty derives the power of the law society, and the power of lawyers, the power of the judiciary, the power of parliament and the legislatures. And so my argument was like, well, law society, if our language was good enough to underpin your sovereignty, it should be good enough to allow me to commit to the bar. 6 months later, having been waited out, if you do your bar course and then you wait a year to get called, you have to redo your bar course, which is expensive and challenging. Just because it's so bloody boring, but also terrifying. It's like war, like truncated, like boring with like terror. That's what it's like. So they waited me out, and it hurt Fiona and Damien a lot, but it hurt me a great deal because my grandfather, who you saw there, is 91 with stage 3 colon cancer. My grandmother with him, Grandma Mary Behn, the one who like fought off the bear at the 30-30 after giving birth in 1955, alone under a tarp. Questions about my grandfather, by the way. That guy, he bailed on her that day. He laughed now, man. She was losing the shit. And like, I come from a very, very interesting background. I'm very privileged to have what I have, but what I have has a timeline, like all of us. It's a countdown. For real, it's a countdown. So what do you do with them? And so those 6 months were brutal for me and my family, and for Damien, Fiona, and for the film. And it reminded me that we all have an obligation to act, which is a convenient segue into the talk. Essentially, my contention, my thesis, if you want to use that language, is that in the Anthropocene, in the age where humans exert truly global influence through many different mechanisms, advocacy and the notion that we engage for certain things and certain objectives has necessarily changed. And I said Advocacy 2.0 because I firmly believe we live in a Web 2.0 world. The omnipresent computing power that we carry, right? Like, you could put someone on the moon with this if you were NASA in the 1960s. This is a time that's magical for people like my grandparents, right? Because they went from like basically contact and like borderline Stone Age into like the space race. And they're still there. And the intention behind the film, and I'll just refer to my notes very briefly, was to convey at a point in my legal education a story that could not be conveyed through law. And interestingly, I actually got kicked out of the BC bar yesterday. I just got the email last night when I got off the plane from Toronto because I failed to pay some fees, and it was late over Christmas. Now I'm like, I'm not actually a lawyer today, and like next week I probably will be once I pay all the fees and do all the forms, but legally speaking, I cannot say that. It's very interesting. Sorry. Synchronicity works in strange ways. Anyways, in the law, when I could formally make submissions to a judge, you're allowed to use narrative and story, but the narrative is innately truncated, right? The scope of the discourse is narrow. You're not allowed, a judge can make, take notice, judicial notice of certain facts, and you can put a lot of facts forward on an evidentiary basis, and you can, kind of massage things to add this and that. But big issues, like for example, cumulative impacts, and you saw some references to cumulative impacts in the film. For those of you from this territory, you've probably seen some cumulative impacts in your own lives, especially the elders in the room. You've seen this territory change, and that's a global truth. And I saw this in law, and I became very, very concerned about the ease with which we could go gently into a dark future. Put simply, the ease with which, we could silo each project and each endeavor and each extractive piece of technology, and yet not account for its collective import to us as a species and to all species. I reject anthropocentrism, because as a life form we rely upon myriad other life forms to give us the necessaries of life, whether it be cotton or wool or, the flora and fauna, well, hopefully fauna, in your belly, all those things, those, we are a derivative species. And so I saw this in law, and I was like, oh my God, like no one has a clue what's going on in Northeast BC, like no one really cares. The Enbridge issue was coming online, but no one really gave a shit about gas and fracking. And Fiona and Damien stepped up and offered me a window to change it. But they didn't tell me until about year 3 or 4 fully that it was about me. Like I didn't know that, and I wouldn't have agreed to it, quite frankly. Because as a young man, I'm having, decreasingly young, as a man, I'm having to account for my male privilege, and I'm having to really focus upon checking my ego and checking my BS and being really humble and making space as a masculinity for other voices. So I'm not sure I would agree to it. Thank you. It's kind of crazy. True upset because it's 2016. Crazy thought. Whoa, slow it down. So I wouldn't have agreed to it, I don't think, at that time. And I prayed on it. I talked to my family about it, and they agreed because we perceived the dominant society, both provincially, federally, nationally, internationally, as ignoring us. And so I thought about it, and I thought about the team, and I agreed to lay myself, my story, my family, my territory on the line. And in return, Damien, Fiona, and by extension you, as witnesses, would bear witness to this place and this space. And in my view, that dynamic, that process, that pattern is indicative of a massive change in how we engage with change for the positive. The thing is that this film has probably cost the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers and other large entities significant resources to counter the assertions. And one of the reasons why, we have interviews with kind of world-leading experts, Naomi Klein, we hung out with her for a bit, Bill McKibben, all these big names. And in the end, they didn't use them in all that interview footage because you can counter a talking head, but you can't counter a story. You don't have to trust me, and I'm sure some of the people in this crowd don't. You don't have to believe in me. You don't have to think the way I think. That's okay. But if nothing else, in witnessing a story, you are compelled to at least account for the similarities. And my true belief is that in the Anthropocene, in a time like this, all of us engage this question of what to do with the remaining count in our chest, right? What do? Do you turn a blind eye? And I'm really impressed with ReFrame because it forces you to turn back to issues that you may not be aware of, that you may not want to engage with, that you may not be familiar with, that exist in different territories or different conceptual spaces and modalities that you don't know, but yet you do. And when you engage in that way through this medium, you become, at some level, accountable to yourself and perhaps to others, but hopefully at least to yourself, with what you've witnessed. And my thinking is that that's critical, because the work that I work on, so where I come from, like you saw the fracking and like some of the, the dams, we have the largest single capital infrastructure investment project in Canadian history, the Site C mega dam. We're fighting that right now in court. We have most of the coal, we have a good chunk of the forestry, we have all the wind power. The first major wind project in BC history is named after my grandfather, but they stole my family name without paying us a dime. We have a good chunk, we have a portion of the hard rock minerals, 98% of all the gas and oil production. We have some of the world's largest fracking operations by volume of water use. We have, there's nuclear proposed, but there's a statutory ban on that, thank God. I mean, no one's discovered diamonds and uranium yet, thank goodness. But you can laugh now, but when it comes to your neck of the woods, it's hell, for real. Especially for someone like my grandparents, who remember a time when the water was clean. 2 days ago, I left my grandmother at 7 a.m. yesterday. That bike near the closing scene, that's the West Mobility First Nations Indian Reserve. And at the far left of this screen, just as that drone was taking that last little shot, you would have seen my grandmother's house. And I made her a fat smoothie, because she doesn't have much teeth right now, and she's 82, so I try and improve her nutrition. And we sat and we talked about where I was going. I was like, I'm going to Toronto, this place called Peterborough, and I'm going to go, talk to these white people. And she's like, oh yeah, good. Bring me beads. Yes. I got your background, don't worry. And the truth is that I don't think you guys would be in those seats if you were raised where I was raised. I think you would be a lot like me. And I wonder if that's really the key for the Anthropocene. That no longer do the divisions matter as much as that which binds us. And look, the problem is that there's so many latent forces that divide us. And this afternoon, myself and Fiona and some other filmmakers, Sue and Vicky, we were sitting and talking about this issue. And there's this point that, documentary film in particular, but a lot of the media arts, they serve to kind of break down those latent walls that exist between us, right? Tugging the heartstrings, you kind of get a window into another person's life. And that's critical, because what I see working on energy issues is a lot of really opaque, really difficult to identify subtle barriers to engagement. And I know like the Energy East issue is a big one over here, the Line 3 expansion. I know the Ring of Fire is a really critical issue over here. I have a number of connections up to that territory. And this is global. And what's happening in my territory, I'm not sure if you guys saw it, but the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin is like the third largest hydrocarbon deposit on the planet. And Treaty 8 sits over like most of it. If you burned all the carbon in my people's territory, we'd go well above the 408 parts per million we're at right now, ambient CO2 concentration globally. It's climate chaos, it's Armageddon from a climate perspective in my territory, if we were to burn it all. And so what we're doing now in my world is we're trying to figure out how to simultaneously delay these projects, which will lock us into a carbon-intensive future. If you build a pipeline, you've got to fill it. Just to service the debt on a $9 billion pipeline, you have to pump gas for like a decade, right? So if you build it, you kind of have to fill it. And if you don't fill it with gas or oil, what do you fill it with? Think about California, 11 and a half years of drought. Something to think about, right? I took on the head of Kinder Morgan a couple of years ago, and I got him to admit that on stage, actually. Because no one spends $8 billion and doesn't think about what else you can put in your pipeline. You can live without oil and gas, you can't live without water. So we find ourselves at this really peculiar time when the mechanisms that divide us are complex, they're entrenched systemically. The touchscreen generation is real. Our children, I don't have children, but maybe someday, if someone puts something long enough. So I'm rowdy like that. But things are changing. And Fractured Land was an attempt to counter that change. It was an attempt to detonate this whole like left-right bullshit, this whole like environmentalist versus economy. Like if you're from the north, and I'm sure some of you guys have been in like kind of the far north or resource extractive environments, it's not as simple as that. You know, those dichotomies are one of those examples of what divides us. The simple notion that there could be a dichotomous identity utterly dedicated to like oil and gas versus like economic development, like that's illusion. But it's illusion with purpose. It's illusion with intention, unstated though it may be, right? It's an illusion with tangible consequence, and that tangible consequence is ambient CO2 concentrations going above 400 parts per million last year, and BTEX being all over the environment, you know, beryllium, selenium, all kinds of heavy metal issues. I mean, I love nerds. I love science, because the best science in this day and age is actually meeting indigenous natural laws and agreeing like you can transfer from trauma through epigenetic mechanisms a different way of engaging cortisol. That happened to my dad because he got violated at 5 years old in residential school. So my kids, if I have kids, and my sister's young son, who turned 1 year old 2 days ago, he will experience cortisol and serotonin and dopamine differently because my dad got violated at 5 years old by a priest in northern BC. Figure that out from a legal perspective, you know? Figure that out from like a human perspective. And that's what this film sort of tries to do in a very subtle way. And that's what I try to do, because my work has legal dimensions, but the legal is insufficient. In biology, diversity breeds resilience, and we need to be resilient as a species, as a society, as people in the shared endeavor. And I was thinking about this. I was sitting having dinner before I came in here, and I realized that, you know, Fractured Land was intention to create diversity by breaking down these binaries. And I think that's what I want to leave you with, this notion that you two are helping us as a collective and me as an individual in breaking down binaries. Because a diversity of ideas, some of the notions I've shared with you this evening, a diversity of perspectives, a diversity of quote-unquote truths, is what makes for a resilient society and a resilient population capable of mitigating its own destructive tendencies, facilitated by massively impactful technologies like fracking and many others, in the face of the simple fact that we don't know the future. And so I want to end with that you're a part of this, whether you like it or not, sucker. You are. You genuinely are. Because you bore witness, because you took the time, because you shared some of your heartbeats with mine. And so I think with that, I'll end and open up to questions. Thank you.
Big wedge. Thank you, Caleb. Let's give it up for Caleb one more time. So at this point, I'd like to also invite Fiona Rayher, one of the co-directors of the film, to join us and to join Caleb here, and we'll take some questions from the audience. So I believe we have about 20 minutes or so for questions.
Be brave. Be brave.
Courage. Just right down here.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for coming to Peterborough, and Caleb, and for Fractured Land, and Damien too. That was really amazing. I was really grateful to see Chief Reuben George. Sunday it's Chief Reuben George, which is the chief that I did a lot of different kinds of ceremonies, you know, in the 5 years that I was living in Vancouver. And Kinder Morgan, the situation, I'm glad you guys spoke about that. I have a lot of friends that were on the front lines getting arrested, grandmothers, and And so that was really touching and really amazing to see that. And my question is in regards to direct action, civil disobedience, and doing, like, using documentary filmmaking and publishing books and social media, different kinds of ways that people can utilize what they've learned here and strategies to be able to go forward and use their voices, like you were saying, and what they've witnessed, to be able to express that articulately to the places like Ministry of Natural Resources, which happen to be in Peterborough, in Ontario, making decision making, and how to encourage people to take that passion that they've learned here into their lives and their livelihoods on a daily basis. Thank you.
For me, Fractured Land is more of a heart-opening film. It's complex, like the character and the subject matter. To tell you what to do doesn't align with the film itself. However, I think probably each and every one of you have something that you're passionate about and something that you can do your little bit to change the world with, which is the good work, even if it's hard, which is what I would leave you with.
Thanks about I guess just to build on that, the only thing that's going to make collective change is fairly coherent engagement, right? Law has utility, as does direct action, as does like the divestment process happening, as does legislative proposals, as does voting, right? All, like, every mechanism, as does art. And actually I should really like put that up top, like, like Louis Riel proposed. We all have a role, but the problem is that it has to be cohesive. And what I've seen in the movement is a lot of lateral violence. I was with Ruben last week. We were at this crazy closed door, borderline secret, Indigenous Peoples Climate Change Planning Conference, invite only. And a whole bunch of people who were invited just like lost their mind. They were like, this is replicating lateral violence, you're all sellouts, blah, 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 blah. And this is the people who give it all. We're talking people who've been like 4 or 5 decades on the front lines. And yet they're getting attacked by like, someone who like banged a drum in Ida Lamore and all of a sudden thought they were God's gift to activism. And these are like my cousins. And so that dynamic is real, and you experience it in any context. And I think that the problem with doing good work in this day and age is that it's by very definition, in a time as twisted and sick as this, it's by definition going to cost something. I learned something in the process of this film and afterwards, that growth doesn't happen in the comfort zone, but healing does. And it took me a long time to kind of understand what that meant, because I work well in adversarial environments. I'm built for war. But I can't be a wounded warrior running around hurting people around me. And so I need to like step back and heal and like own my ish, or else I was hurting everything that I love dear. And I think that's one thing that I would ask all of us to kind of reflect with and sit on, sit with and reflect on and sit with, because I've done a lot of damage to the movement, and I'll always have to atone for that failure as a man, as an individual. And be careful in the good work that you do, because it is like it's the most important undertaking, and it happens like in this moment and only this moment. This is the only moment you have to change the world. And often we just like try to let it go by and get engaged in the mundane details of life and forget the fact that like we are God's gift to creation because we exist in the nexus of change. That's what like existence is. That's what this moment is, and this moment, and this moment, and this moment for the rest of your life. And that's important to like put that inside. No worries. Anything else, guys? You can ask like technical film questions. Like,
is this the microphone for using?
Okay.
Sorry, after this gentleman.
Sure.
So I'd like to start by saying Cho Kanaskumin for sharing and for giving us the space to ask questions. I was actually supposed to meet you today at 2:30, but just catching up on much needed sleep. So my name is Brennan Campbell. I'm an Indigenous student here at Trent in the program here at James. James is one of my instructors. So the question I have is for Caleb. You can answer it as well if you like in your own capacities, but it's largely to do with like advocacy. I'm also an Indigenous student in my union, and I've worked within my union, but also the Canadian Federation of Students. So I'm fortunate that next week I will be with the National Aboriginal Caucus of the Canadian Federation of Students lobbying as part of the National Lobby Week. My question, I guess, for you is, do you have any advice or any materials or perhaps any networking that you can suggest to me as a member of the National Aboriginal Caucus, I guess, in lobbying in a largely colonized space?
Well, I mean, like, find me afterwards, and we can like chat about materials, because I have like an obscenely large research index. I think the simple advice is like, you gotta do some self-care and be resilient, because like advocacy in a colonized environment like innately breaks down your spirit, and that's the truth, and not just Indigenous people, by the way. Like, recognize this, my like non-Indigenous brothers and sisters. It will eat your spirit too. Okay, like I know that sounds kind of hokey and like like crystal was over my bed and that kind of shit, but no, like, I mean seriously, genuinely, your spirit, that piece of the God spark inside you, will be desecrated by engagement with really oppressive, essentializing systems. And you feel it, like, you genuinely feel it. So my advice to you is do ceremony first, do ceremony after, and find your brothers and sisters and stand strong together. Because we stand together, for sure we will hang apart, to reference the War for Independence. And that's at a legal level, I can offer some advice on like how to engage with those structures. I'm all about identity, so I come from like a trapping culture, so I was taught to like lay traps, both in law and physically. So I can give you some advice, but let's save that for when we're not in front of a whole bunch of people who might be working for CSIS or RCMP. You think I'm joking? We have CSIS stalking us where I'm from right now because of the Sightsee Mega Project. So I'm not sure how many of you guys know what a critical infrastructure investigation team is, which is a unit between CSIS, the RCMP, and certain private sector stakeholders, like the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. These are elite level kind of like investigation SWAT teams designed to infiltrate and disrupt anything that threatens the supposedly critical infrastructure. Well, I'll tell you, the most critical infrastructure is right here and in between us. That's critical infrastructure. Not a pipeline. You gotta watch yourself. You watch yourself in this war, because it will kill you. Yeah, and it has other people. That's the truth. Any other questions, you guys? Including like, you have Fee, who's a badass young female filmmaker, worse than Indigenous people.
I was gonna say, you could, you can just tell me that it's a stupid idea, but if you could screen the film, I don't know if that would, like, in whatever capacity. There's a lot of people are approaching us to screen it in their communities, and I mean, Damien and I do everything ourselves, so it's a really great method for us, because we can't distribute the film ourselves in the way that it deserves to be distributed without the support of the public. So.
You said take advantage of the moment, so I'm at the microphone. I'm a member of a group for grandchildren whose primary concern has been to motivate people to act on climate change. I'm also a long-term supporter of KWIC World Issues Cafe, who's one of the co-sponsors of this organization tonight. And one of the things we've got planned, in fact, this coming Tuesday night, 7 o'clock, in the St. Paul's Church Hall, which is just down Water Street, just past the police station, we've got a session looking at climate change and social reform. And because, I mean, what you've said tonight just amplifies the fact that you can't solve climate change without solving problems of Indigenous rights, problems of global, of wealth inequity within the country, health issues, and so on. So what we've got, we're having a citizens forum that's looking at a number of these different issues that are embodied in what's been called the LEAP Manifesto, which I'm sure you're aware of, the LEAP Manifesto, and trying to get both goals and actions for this community. So this is an invitation to everybody here to show up to St. Paul's at 7 o'clock this coming Tuesday. But secondly, when we look for goals and actions, do you have recommendations as to how those should be directed? Obviously, some of them are just expanding the local groups to work in them, but some of them may be writing policy for government. So what would you recommend?
Okay, so I'm like fairly agnostic when it comes to change in some ways. Like I don't want to replicate kind of the spiritually, violating principles of like colonization and the good work that we do. But one, adopting non-oppressive critical theory and foreign practices, really engaging with like post-colonial discourse and what it means to be a solid ally is good work. I segment my work into short-term strategies, medium-term, and long-term, and I design my initiatives and the initiatives I work on in that sense. In the short term, I think we're in triage mode. So the smart thing to do is simultaneously focus upon like local solutions to the climate change issue. People talk about climate change in terms of like abatement and stopping climate change. I approach it more as like that's one pillar. The other pillar is surviving climate change. And from an indigenous perspective, like my Echo Dene Daneza people surviving as Echo Dene and Daneza. So, part of the work I do, like I'm trying to get one of our local sawmills turned entirely solar, totally off-grid solar and electric so that we can build cabins without getting our power cut by BC Hydro because we're litigating a giant dam. So that we can go build cabins up high in the mountain where you're likely to have functional growth of like food plants once climate change raises ambient temperatures 2 or 3 degrees in about 40, 50 years. So like we're planning for survival. And that's sad. That really sucks. Protect your source water. Know where your source water comes from. Get your baseline data, because without that, you can either litigate someone for violating what you have or understand what you have. Third, look at your people and engage with your community and crystallize latent constituencies who have like nexuses of interest, or interests are aligned. In the medium term, look to law and emergent legal principles, in particular expanding the notions of legal personhood. So the funding Rayher in 2012, I think it was, got granted legal personhood. That idea that like not just corporations should have this very unique suite of rights, that's a good idea for engaging things like a right to a healthy environment, which I think Naomi included in her assertions. In the long term, prepare for things to get real shitty. Yeah, no, it sounds like, and I don't say that lightly. I mean, prepare to change your expectations of what our lives can and will be, because this largesse is not sustainable. All the hydrocarbons that went into the creation of these seats. It's going to have long-term consequences. So starting to really engage with your own expectations of what life is, I think, is what will help new communities manifest and be able to withstand what's coming. And the reason I say it that way is because I come from, on both sides of my family, a very strong prophecy tradition, a prophetic tradition. There's prophets all over my family, and most of our prophecies speak of a hard time where human survival is not a foregone conclusion. And that's sad and that's scary, but it does put things in the right kind of frame. Paragraph 186 in Delbin ended with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court saying, well, we have to figure out reconciliation because we're all here to stay. No, we're not all here to stay. No, there's no presumption that says that our species is somehow special. Our destruction might suggest that. But, you've got the Zika virus all over Latin America right now. You've got water issues globally. You've got endocrine disruptors rising globally. You've got all kinds of issues that suggest that, things aren't quite so resilient as we would often believe. And that means that you have to engage with the implications of that long term if you're going to build a sustainable community. Don't start from a position of privilege. Start from a position of humility. And that will help create the kind of space you need to be resilient, in my view. Any other questions, guys? Thank you.
One more question, and after this, if anybody would like to ask another question of Fiona or Caleb, please stick around, but for others, after this comment, we'll be sending you over to the venue for a 10 o'clock local music and spoken word event. But one last question.
Thank you. Has the federal leadership change and the price of oil affected your work in terms of seeing an opening? And a technical film question, did you lose or break any drones with all those shots?
If we were flying the drones, we would have broken one for sure, but that drone footage was shot at the tail end of the film when we actually had a little bit of money to play with, so we hired a drone cinematographer, which is a new thing for a couple of days, so he was pretty good and he took care of his gear, so no.
I would definitely lose some drones in the near future. Federal leadership. I've been getting this one a lot. Actually, I went off on APTN last week. I didn't get in trouble for some of that interview. Because I called him out over his dad. Because my dad fought his dad in '85 at the First Ministers Conference in '87. I think I was moderating those two, but it was the consequences of his dad, you know, the white paper and all that stuff. Christian wrote the white paper. I worked under the guy who wrote Section 35 of the Constitution, Jack Woodward, an indigenous, non-indigenous, but an ally. The federal government, and in particular mandate letters to McKenna, Carr, and Hunter Tutu are critical to my people, because Hunter Tutu's ministry will authorize the permits that facilitate the Site C Dam being built, because it's habitat destruction in the major waterways that can impact fish. So I'm working on that issue. I had a major resolution passed at the AFN again 2 years after that footage was shot in December that successfully went through this time. Calling out McKenna, calling out Hunter, calling out a whole bunch of people on the basis of their mandate. So we're engaging, but the problem is, you know, we're kind of going to kill a really good idea in its infancy if the progressive movement in this country just puts all our hopes in the Trudeau government. Because governments come and go, bureaucracies stay. And this point was made in Maclean's 3 weeks ago. But you know, the Harper government appointed 600 approximately of 840-ish federally appointed judges throughout Canada. In addition to things like 4 Supreme Court appointments. And not to call it the judges, but I mean, we don't know what that's going to do. And like, they don't get elected every 4 years. They're in for life. That's a generation that will change the substrate that underpins this country, the law. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but my people, we don't have the right or the privilege to put our faith in other people. We've done that. That's what treaty was, right? That's what we did in treaty. You know, and over 100 years later, we're still being violated. So I don't think, you know, in good conscience, I can be hopeful, because it would be a disrespect to all the people who suffered and died at the hands of good promises. I'm not going to do it. I can't do it, right? I would love to say, like, hell is going to change, but my advocacy has to be just the advocacy that I do. I can't rely upon, you know, Minister Raybould. Love her to death. She's done good work, but I can't rely on her. She's an individual. This is a systems problem. This is as much about, you know, our consumptive practices as it is about a given piece of legislation. So that, you know, so it doesn't allow you that freedom to kind of have that hope. I wish I could say I did, truly, but I can't. On the price of oil and commodity pricing question, I mean, it's interesting to me that people don't recognize how little care corporations have for their own. You know, 50,000 layoffs the last 3 months in the oil sector. And these workers, like in my territory, they're all getting mad at the Indians, being like, you broke the jobs, blah. And I'm like, you're getting fired by a corporation who doesn't give a shit about you or your kids. The fact that you were sold the Alberta dream as a 17-year-old man and never trained to save money. No one modeled for these young guys how to save money. They're the ones who are going to suffer the worst. You should see the drug wars happening in Calgary, Edmonton, all over the West, because people, like, they got pinched. And when you get pinched, people get high. And when people get high and get rich, you get war. And it's happening all over the West right now. It's crazy. It's insane. There's a huge war in Dawson Creek. People are getting, like, tortured in a town of, like, 15,000. Because like the price of oil goes down and everyone gets fired, everyone gets high, but doesn't have the money to pay their bills, and things get ugly. You know, so indeed the price of oil, like it gives us a bit of breathing room because we're not going to ram through a bunch of projects, but that has its own consequences, right? And what's going to happen is all the major players, and you see this in the BG sell to Shell, it's like half of a $500 billion buyout, some ungodly number. In what you're going to see is the big operators eating all the little fish who became medium fish in the oil and gas sector. You're going to see massive market centralization. You're going to see like vertical integration. And they're going to cut down costs, they're going to cut down royalties, they're going to cut down taxes, they're going to argue with the new government saying that you can't, modernize the NEB process and kill projects. They're going to litigate in NAFTA, which is happening with Transcan over Keystone. You're going to see the same thing with like any progressive legislation provincially from like either municipalities or provinces saying you're not allowed to hurt our profit imperative because you contracted us essentially, you sold us the 10 years. We had a reasonable expectation of profit. And what's going to happen is it's going to be another kind of fight. Jobs, jobs, jobs. And so that's why you need to focus on the renewable side and prove out the viability of like alternative renewable energy. But that's a tough gig. It's a really tough gig. But that's the kind of work I'm doing right now, is trying to figure all that stuff out. Like, okay, who's buying who and why? Anyways, you guys, please, I think we've taken much of your time.
Thank you very much to Behn, to Fiona, Rayher. Before you go, a couple of quick announcements. Good words. Sobering words.
I'll try not to get this far again.
Inspiring words. As you said in the film, we don't have 1,000 years to get this right. And as we discussed this afternoon, good medicine takes a long time. The good work takes a long time. And we need to have the patience for that. With that in mind, we are under a time deadline, go figure. Next door at the venue, there is a very special event tonight, local music and spoken word. But first and foremost, a big thank you to Behn, to Fiona Rayher. On behalf of the KWIC World Issues Center, a very big thank you to ReFrame for a spectacular weekend of film, to our sponsors, and to each and every one of you for sharing this inspiring and motivating evening with us. Thank you.